Before we get into this story, if you're new here, welcome to Velvet Shadows. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. We read every single one. Now let's get into it. The morning Declan Whitmore told his wife she was an embarrassment to his family. She was standing in their kitchen at 6:43 a.m. in her old law school sweatshirt holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. She hadn't slept. Not because of a fight. Not because of anything dramatic. She hadn't slept because the brief she was drafting, a federal antitrust case that 3 senior partners had already passed on, had a hole in it, and she'd found the hole at 11:15 the night before, and she couldn't close her eyes until she'd filled it. She'd filled it at 4:30. She'd made coffee. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table when Declan came downstairs in his press shirt, looked at her, looked at the papers spread across the table, and said, not loudly, not in anger, just in that flat, certain tone he'd perfected over 7 years of marriage. "You know, my mother asked me again why you never come to Sunday dinners." I didn't know what to say to her. "You look like you haven't showered in 2 days. This is embarrassing." Josephine Whitmore, née Carver, though she hadn't been called that in years, looked at her husband. Then she looked at the brief. Then she picked up her cold coffee and took a sip. "I'll be at Sunday dinner this week," she said. She wasn't. Here's what you need to understand about Josephine before this story goes any further. She was not a woman who came from money. She grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, in a house where the water heater broke every winter and stayed broken until spring, because replacing it cost $800 they didn't have. Her mother cleaned hotel rooms. Her father drove a delivery truck. Until his back gave out, and then he just drove. She'd gotten into law school on a full scholarship and a 900-word personal statement that made the admissions committee, according to one of them who told her this years later at a conference, feel like we'd failed her by not admitting her sooner. She'd graduated second in her Sutton. She'd joined Hargrove and Sutton, one of the oldest, most prestigious litigation firms in Washington, D.C. As an associate at 26, she'd made junior partner at 31. She was 38 when Declan told her she was an embarrassment. She'd billed over 2,000 hours every single year she'd been at that firm. Declan's family had money, old money. The kind that came from grandfather's grandfather and sat quietly in trusts and property portfolios. Declan himself worked in finance, something that sounded important when he described it at dinner parties and was, when she'd actually looked at the numbers, moderately successful. Not remarkable. Not the kind of work that changed anything. He'd married her because she was brilliant and beautiful, and, as she understood later, because having a wife who'd gone to law school made him interesting at those same dinner parties. He had not married her because he wanted a partner. The cracks had been there from the beginning. She knew that. She wasn't naive about it. When she'd worked through their first Christmas because a client was in crisis, Declan had spent the holiday with his family and told them she had a headache when she'd been passed over for a promotion at 33 because a male colleague with 2 fewer wins had been given it instead, and she'd come home furious and shaking and needing someone to be furious with her. Declan had said, "Maybe they just think he's a better fit for the role right now." He never once asked her how a case went. He knew the names of 3 of her clients in 7 years of marriage. He called her work her thing. She told herself it was fine. She told herself this was what marriage looked like when 2 people had demanding lives. She told herself she was not the kind of woman who needed constant emotional tending. She was practical. She was strong. She had work to do. What she didn't let herself say out loud, not to her sister, not to her one close friend from law school, not to herself, until much later, was that she was lonely. Profoundly, specifically lonely in the way that is only possible when you are technically not alone. The case that changed everything was called Meridian v. Consolidated Northern Rail. She won't bore you with the legalese. Here's what it meant in plain language. Consolidated Northern Rail had spent 11 systematically underpaying property owners along a 17-state railway corridor, mostly farmers, mostly rural communities, mostly people who didn't have the resources to fight a billion-dollar corporation. The total amount they'd been shortchanged was somewhere north of $400 million. Every law firm that had been approached about taking the case had declined. The liability was too dispersed. The litigation would take years. The defendant had unlimited resources. The lead partner at Hargrove and Sutton had read the intake memo and sent it back with a single note: not viable. Josephine had read the intake memo at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday and felt something shift in her chest. She went to the senior partner, a man named Howard Sutton, 71 years old, the kind of man who had framed photographs with 3 different presidents on his office wall, and she asked for 6 months to build the case on spec. She'd work it alongside her regular caseload. She wasn't asking for resources. She was asking for permission. He'd looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he'd said. "Because it's right," she'd said. "And because we can win it." He'd given her the 6 months. That was in February. By April, Declan had stopped asking when she'd be home for dinner. By June, he'd started having dinner with his college in Sterling, a name she'd heard before but never paid much attention to. 2-3 times a week. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She told herself she was being paranoid. She had a class action to build. She worked the Meridian case the way she had worked every impossible thing in her life. Methodically, quietly, without complaint, without stopping. She drove to rural counties in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Georgia and sat across kitchen tables from farmers who'd been fighting this company for a decade and told them she believed them and she was going to do something about it. She meant it. By August, she had signed 47 plaintiffs. By September, she had documentary evidence, internal. CNR, communications, she'd obtained through a source she'd spent 3 months cultivating, that showed the company had known about the underpayments for 6 years and had deliberately buried the actuarial reports. She brought it to Howard. He sat with the file for 2 days. Then he called her into his office and said, "We're filing." The night before she filed the suit, she came home at midnight to find Declan sitting at the kitchen table. Her kitchen table, her papers cleared, her coffee mug moved, with his phone face down and a glass of whiskey he'd clearly been sitting with for a while. "We should talk," he said. She set down her bag. He didn't look at her. He looked at the table. He said, and she would remember the exact words for the rest of her life, "I need you to understand that I have tried to be patient with you. I have tried to make this work. But I have needs too, and you have made it very clear over and over again that your career will always come first. I can't keep living like this. Are you asking me to choose?" She sat down. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "I've already made my choice. My attorney will be in touch." He picked up his phone and walked upstairs. She sat at the table for a long time. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was, and she would struggle to explain this later, almost relieved. Not because she didn't love him. She had tried in the ways she knew how to be what he needed. But there was something exhausting about waiting for someone to see you, year after year, and feeling yourself getting smaller. In the trying, she was done being small. She picked up the brief on the kitchen table and read it one more time. Then she went upstairs to the guest room. She'd been sleeping there for 2 months, though neither of them had said so out loud, and she set her alarm for 5 a.m. She filed the suit at 9:17 the next morning. The coverage started within 48 hours. The Washington Post ran it first, then the Times, then every regional paper in the 17 affected states picked it up. The story was not just about the money, though the money was significant, and the number 400 million appeared in every headline.
The story was about the communities.
The farmers who'd been telling their local officials for years that something was wrong. The actuarial reports that had been buried in a Cincinnati archive room for 6 years. And the attorney, a woman from Roanoke, Virginia, who'd taken the case on spec when every major firm had said no. Her name was everywhere. Declan called her on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the filing. She let it go to voicemail. He left a message that said, "I just wanted to say, I hope you're well." She didn't call back. His attorney sent the divorce petition in October. It was aggressive. Declan was claiming a share of future earnings from the Meridian case on the grounds that it had been developed during the marriage using marital assets, her time, effectively, and the firm resources she'd accessed. It was a creative argument. It was also, she knew immediately, going to fail. She had documentation, meticulous. Because she was meticulous about everything, showing that she'd worked the case almost entirely outside firm hours, that the source cultivation had been personal, and that the only marital asset she'd used was her own brain. She didn't send emotionally. She didn't call Declan. She didn't send a letter. She forwarded the petition to her own attorney, a woman she'd gone to law school with, sharper than anyone she'd ever met, and said, "Let's make this clean." What Declan didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because she hadn't told anyone except Howard and 2 members of the Meridian litigation team, was that 3 days before his attorney filed that petition, she had been approached by a firm she couldn't name yet. A firm that was putting together a consortium to purchase Hargrove and Sutton's entire litigation practice and spin it off as an independent entity. The number they'd put on the table was $640 million. She was the reason they were buying it. Her name, her record, the Meridian case, that was the asset. That was the valuation driver. Howard had looked at her across his desk and said, "They want you to stay on as named partner. Your name, Josephine," on the door. She'd said she needed a few days. She'd gone home, to the apartment she'd moved into in September, quiet and small and entirely her own, and she'd sat with it. Then she'd said yes. The deal closed on a Wednesday morning in November. She signed the paperwork in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Georgetown. There were 8 people at the table. The lead on the acquisition, a man named Clifford Vane, 64 years old, silver-haired, the kind of face that had spent decades making decisions and showed it without apology, slid the final signature page across to her and said, "Welcome to Carver and Associates." Her name, her maiden name. The name she'd quietly asked to be reinstated 6 weeks earlier before the deal had even been finalized, because she had a feeling. She signed on the line. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. Declan. She turned it face down and slid it back into her bag. The divorce was finalized that same month. His claim on the Meridian earnings was dismissed. Her attorney had handled it in 3 motions, clean and thorough. He received what he was entitled to, the equity in their shared property, divided fairly, and nothing else. His attorney had apparently told him about the acquisition by then. Someone had talked. These things always got out. She heard through a mutual friend that Declan had tried to have his attorney file an emergency motion to revisit the settlement on the grounds of undisclosed marital assets. The judge denied it in 4 sentences. Here's the part people always want to know. Did he reach out? Did he apologize? Did he try, in some spectacular way, to undo yes to all 3? He sent an email in December, long, thoughtful in structure if not in substance. He said he had not understood, at the time, the scope of what she was building. He said he had let his own frustrations cloud his judgment. He said, and this was the sentence she read 3 times, "I think I was intimidated by you, and I didn't know how to say that, so I made you feel small instead." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. She read the email twice. She sat with it for a day. She thought about the kitchen table at 6:43 in the morning and the cold coffee and the word embarrassing. She typed back 1 sentence. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Declan." She hit send. She did not hear from him again. The Meridian case settled 14 months later for $467 million. It was one of the largest rural property rights settlements in federal court history. The lead attorney of record was listed as Josephine Carver of Carver and Associates, Washington, D.C. She flew to a small farm outside of Staunton, Virginia, to tell one of her first plaintiffs, a 73-year-old woman named Bet, who'd been fighting CNR for 9 years, and had told Josephine at their first meeting, "I just want my grandkids to know I didn't give up," in person. Bet hugged her on the front porch for a long time. Josephine drove back to Washington in the dark, and somewhere on I-81 she started crying. Not from grief, not from relief exactly, but from something she didn't have a precise word for, something that felt like the end of a very long-held breath. She was 40 years old. Her name was on the door. She had not once in the 12 months since that kitchen table conversation missed a night of sleep over a man who had never once asked her how a case went. There's something no one tells you about choosing yourself. Not in the inspirational quote sense, not in the social media montage sense. in the real daily unglamorous sense. It doesn't feel like triumph. It mostly feels like work. Like sitting in an apartment at midnight with a brief and a cold cup of coffee and doing the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. Not because anyone is watching or applauding or calling it brave, but because the work is there and you are capable of it, and the alternative. Making yourself smaller so someone else can feel more comfortable is something you have finally, at last, decided you can no longer afford. Josephine Carver is not famous. She's not on magazine covers. She doesn't have a podcast or a book deal or a headline that captures everything she is in a single sentence. She has her name on a door on the 14th floor of a building in Georgetown. She has a farm family in Staunton, Virginia who got what they were owed. She has a sister she calls every Sunday. She sleeps 8 hours a night. That, she will tell you, if you ever get the chance to ask her, is plenty. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. And if you know someone who needed to hear this today, share it with them. We'll see you in the next one.